Hi, I'm Jen from Beaker Button and I'm going to show you how to make a Grindle button. This is a Dorset button, sort of, that's made around a mould. You're going to need a strong thread, sharp darning needle and blunt needles, cotton fabric and wadding, 8-weight cotton thread and some scissors. And before you start, you'll need to make a button mould, which you'll find in one of our other videos, using the cotton, the wadding, both needles and the strong thread. So I've made my button mould in a contrasting fabric to the thread that I'm going to use to stitch, because that will make it easier for you to see how the stitches work. So I'm going to thread my 8-weight cotton onto a sharp needle and put a big knot in the end, and I'm passing the needle through the middle of the button so it comes out in the centre at the top. So I've gone in at the base and I'm coming out at the top, and I tend to use the table to push the mould down over the needle. You can use some pliers to pull through if you rather. You're going to pull that all the way through, and then you're going to go back in the same place at the base and come out at the same place at the top and all the way through again. So again, if you struggle to pull the needle through, get some little pliers, that works really nicely. So that lays your first spoke along one side. And now I'm going to do the same thing across the mould, so I get one that's halfway round, making sure when I push it through that I'm coming out in that same hole again. I'm watching my fingers, I don't want to stab myself. Pull it through, and then I'm going to put another spoke, so the same process, in at the base and out in the same hole, and make another spoke off to the left and then off to the right. So I've basically quartered my mould. It's the easiest way to get your spokes fairly accurate. You'll end up with 8 spokes for this. Obviously, if you want more or less spokes, you'll need to space them in a different way, and you can stitch them one after the other if you want to. And just fill in that last one. And I'm going to make spokes in between the gaps, basically. So coming up between those quarter points. Same process, just put the needle in at the bottom of the mould, pull it out in the same place as the top, and you'll fill in all the gaps, make it nice and even all the way around. I'm pulling fairly tight over my mould. I want the spokes to be quite tight up against the side so they don't move around too much. And if you don't get it in that centre point, it's better to take the needle back and then try again. It does get easier the more you make your spokes, generally, because you'll make a little channel through with the needle. You'll find it's slightly easier to push it through in the right place mostly. So that's all my spokes done. And then I'm going to just move them around a little, make them nice and even. And then I'm going to take the sharp needle off and add my blunt needle. So this is a size 18 tapestry needle, but whatever you're comfortable working with. The reason for using a blunt needle is when we're stitching around the spokes, we don't want to catch the threads. So I'm stitching over spoke 1 and spoke 2. Doesn't matter where you start, but that will become spoke 1 and 2. Then I'm going to go under 2 and 3. So I'm stitching under the last spoke from the last stitch and the next one from the next stitch. So under 3 and 4, and then 4 and 5. So this is a back stitch around the spokes. It's the same process if you've made a different type of Dorset button, that you do your rounding around a cross wheel, for example. You'll go over 1 and under 2, but it's performed slightly differently because you're doing that under 2 in one go. And you'll just keep stitching round. And you'll create a little cover. So every now and then I use the side of my needle just to push those stitches back in to the top there, stop them getting too saggy and too loose, and to make sure that the covering is even. If you're a weaver, it's the same thing as beating your weft. And I'm pulling fairly tight. I've got one spoke that's getting a little wobbly, so I'm keeping my finger on that as I'm pulling tight so it doesn't move around too much. These are one of my favourite buttons because you can make little urchins with it. They're really cute. So once you've got your pattern established, you can whip around quite nicely. Just keeping that back stitch correct so all the spokes sit up proud. So if you find you're getting a bit tangly, or you find that you're getting a lot of twist in your thread, the easiest way to get rid of that is to hold the needle up, let go of the button, and just let the twist out of the thread. So here I'm just beating my threads again, just keeping my stitches nice and neat. I don't do it every stitch, but every now and then when I think about it, if I think they're getting a bit loose, I'll just push them back into place. So just keeping that back stitch correct all the way round. It's quite soothing sitting in front of the telly and doing this. So, little knot there, so I'm just going to unpick that with the needle. Generally they're little slip knots and you just pull them apart. And you'll keep going until you get down to about 10 or 15 centimetres of thread. You can see it just covers really nicely around the edge. There's one of those little slip knots I was talking about, so you just pull that out. Generally you can unpick them with the needle. It usually means that there's too much twist in the thread, so you just let that unspin. And then you can carry on stitching. So when you run low on thread, you're going to change to the sharp needle. So take the blunt one off and put the sharp needle on. And you're going to make a stitch underneath the last spoke that you went under. So that would also be the first spoke of the next stitch if you were carrying on. But you're going to take it right through the button and come out somewhere in the uncovered bit. And then you're going to stitch down in the same place that you came out, so you don't get a mark in your work, and take it right down to the bottom. So effectively you've passed the thread twice through the mould, and then you can just trim it off. It'll be nice and secure. Then you're going to take off another couple of meters, make a knot in the end and thread it onto the sharp needle. Pass the needle up through the base and come out to the left of the spoke that you went under just now. So you're coming out as if to do that stitch again. And then you're going to take a tiny, tiny stitch underneath that spoke, just a tiny bit of thread, tiny bit of fabric rather, and then pass the needle under the next spoke as well. But the needle will be on top of the fabric at that point. So you won't see that stitch, and it should just sit nicely. And you'll have the next stitch ready to go, and you can keep that back stitch correct. So you would thread the blunt needle back on, so you can't, just makes it easier not to catch the fabric underneath. And then carry on with that back stitch. And you'll keep going right down to the bottom. You'll go as far into the centre at the bottom as you can get, but you won't cover the whole thing. So you'll get to the point where you can't pass the needle through anymore. Once you get to that point, you know it's covered all the way round. Don't worry about that at the bottom there, because it's going to be sewn onto something, so you're not going to see it anyway. As long as you've got that covering all the way around the sides and then just curling into the bottom, it'll be fine. So if you take the blunt needle off and add the sharp needle, and what we're going to do is make a shank at the bottom. So you could at this point, if you want to, pass the thread twice through the back to make it nice and secure, and then just use the tail to sew it on. But I'm going to show you how to make a shank. So you're going to pass the needle through to the centre at the base, and then take a tiny stitch, firm but tiny stitch, and leave a little loop. It's up to you how big the loop you leave, but I tend to try and leave one that's about 2 or 3 millimeters from the surface of the button. And then you're going to come back to the same place and make another loop. So here, because I had to pass it all the way through to get a good clean stitch, I'm going back in where I came out to the start of the first loop, and then I'm making another stitch in the same place just to make a second loop. Gets quite knotty at the bottom there, so sometimes you have to bodge it slightly. And then you've got 2 loops that are the same, and you're going to blanket stitch around those loops. So you bring the needle through the loops, and then, but don't pull tight, and then pass the needle from right to left underneath the loop of thread that's left, and pull it tight at that point. So this is exactly like casting, when you cast around a button ring for doing a Dorset button for something like a cross wheel. And you're going to just stitch all the way around, keeping those 2 loops together and making a nice blanket stitch all the way around the edge, around the loops rather. And that gives you your shank for sewing your button onto something. Makes it easier to sew grindles onto something, having a shank, especially if you want to use it as a button rather than just decoration. I try not to let my little loop twist, the one that I'm passing my needle back through, and come from the bottom and sort of take that twist out as I'm stitching. Just finishing off the other side. Can be a little fiddly those last few stitches, just neatens it off. And I'm just going to take that knot out of the way. I'm just going to trim that as it gets in the way. And then once you've done your shank, you can pass the needle twice through the button. Again, use the table just to push it down, or a pair of pliers, and trim that thread off. And you can use the shank to sew it on. And that's your button. Just straightening out the sides a little bit there. So that's your Grindle button all done. And there's different schools of thought as to whether they're real Dorset buttons, but they're the first ones, moulded buttons, that I learnt. I love them. That's it, all done. So thank you for watching, and check out beakerbutton.co.uk for all sorts of tools and materials and books. Hope you enjoy making your button. Thank you.